Welcome to The Blast Zone, the podcast where we dig up the bombs that shook Hollywood and try to find out why they went up in flames. This week, an auteur director in the 70s goes to the jungle to make his masterpiece and loses his mind. And that could actually be about 15 different movies. This is Sorcerer. Welcome to The Blast Zone.
Welcome to The Blast Zone.
We are not a podcast about bad movies. We are a podcast about movies that did badly.
That's right.
I am Jon Drake, in-house film critic of my Letterboxd account.
And I'm Ian Dukes. I'm a person with thoughts and feelings, and some of them are about movies.
Movies like Sorcerer, which we're talking about today. But before we get into that, Ian, how are you doing this week? I see you're above ground, so you have not sunk into the Pacific Ocean yet. I know LA has been getting hit by quite a bit of water.
We're always at risk to sink below the waves into the briny deep, but no, not this week. Not to discount anybody who was affected by the storms, but it's sort of at the fringes and the foothills and whatnot where mudslides and flooding start to become an issue. I am not too susceptible where I'm at, thankfully. Hope everybody around here is safe and sound. I'm doing a little better than last week. I have an update to give you.
Ooh.
I deleted SimCity from my phone. I talked about this last week.
Nice.
It had become a dangerous and destructive addiction. I had a little moment where I was like unhappy with the game. It made me do a thing and I'm like, I didn't mean to do that. Screw this game. And I used that as the opening, like, okay, I don't need it. I'm deleting it. It's gone. I felt little pangs of, I need to grab my phone and entertain myself with a game. And those happened for a few days afterwards. It's pretty amazing how quickly and deeply that thing set its hooks in me. But it's been a week. I'm pretty much over it. I'm not feeling those withdrawal symptoms. I'm feeling lighter. I'm getting more sleep, getting more done. So
yeah, your hands look steady. I don't see any shaking going on.
I'm not shaking too bad anymore. And I hope if there's anybody out there that was suffering like I was from a rapid and silly video game addiction, that you can kick it too. If I can do it, you can.
We've all been there, I think, at this point. Mine was Golf Clash, which is like a mobile golf game you could play.
Okay.
They really try to get you to spend some money on that thing. And
Oh, yeah.
they got me a couple times before I was finally like, what am I doing? Like, to what end?
Yes.
What is the goal here? When will I be satisfied? But I don't need any more stuff. Yeah, those mobile games are fucking scary. They're just formulated to suck you in and bleed you dry.
It's weird when you feel the echoes of it in your brain. And like, I didn't have any intellectual attachment to this game. It was a good game. It was fun. But like, I didn't have any meaning to me. And yet my brain would just go off at intervals. Like, you need game now, play game. I'm like, whoa, that's freaky.
Yeah, stick to the regular games, the ones you have to buy.
Yeah.
They're less likely to try to manipulate you into spending money because you already spent it.
I'm into this game called podcasting.
Oh.
I do it once a week. And so it's under control, but I haven't been able to stop.
It does cost us money. Just a little bit, though. Did you happen to watch anything this week that you thought would be fun to share with the listeners?
I did. I watched something fresh and new, and I wanted to share it while it's fresh and new. It's a TV show this time. It's called Paul T. Goldman, just the name of a person. It's a original series on Peacock. It's hard for me to tell you what it is. It has the shape of a true crime documentary or a drama like Dirty John about a real life guy who gets into a relationship and gets scammed maybe. But then you get a little deeper. It's actually more of a docu-comedy. I guess that's a new term being thrown around for things like Borat and Nathan Fielder's recent works. It's very hard to tell what's true in it. Paul T. Goldman is the name of a real guy, apparently, but that's not his real name. But he says his real name on the show, but it may not be true. And you don't know. And that's part of the fun of it, is the discovery. It's only 4 episodes in. I'm caught up so far, but it's a show that's dropping episodes weekly. So there's still a lot of mystery hanging over it. There's still a lot of suspense to the actual crime scamming story within the story, and also the story of who is this guy and are we supposed to trust what he's telling us? But I'm really enjoying it. I'm telling people, if you liked The Tinder Swindler and Coffin Flop, this show might be for you.
It's not illegal to film them. They ain't got no souls. Full disclosure, you had told me about this show a couple days ago and I was intrigued, but I didn't have time to check it out yet. And I'll tell you why, because while we're talking about like eccentric white guys, I was spending some time with one myself this week, Mr. Howard Hughes.
Oh, that's top of the list eccentric.
You don't get much more eccentric and or white than Howard Hughes.
True.
And I'm not talking the one from The Rocketeer that's just a swell guy who comes in at the end to save the day. No, like I watched The Aviator, the Martin Scorsese, Howard Hughes biopic. I've been on a bit of a Leo kick lately. Maybe I'm getting excited for Killers of the Flower Moon, which is coming some point this year. I don't exactly know. Maybe in the spring. So I watched Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which is just great when one of my favorite Leo performances.
I do like
fan.
that.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then I also checked out The Wolf of Wall Street, which I was more lukewarm on my first time around. I wanted to revisit it. John Tidbit, I actually worked for Steve Madden for 3 years, and he factors in a large way into that movie. So I had a little bit of an insider. Obviously, I worked for him much later than the events depicted in the movie, but still, I worked there when the movie came out, and it was very tense around the office. Like, don't talk about the movie.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
He was not happy with his portrayal, I think. But then I moved on to The Aviator, and it wasn't like a conscious decision. I was just scrolling through my movies that I own. They're in alphabetical order, so you can see how The Aviator popped up pretty early on in the search.
Sure.
And I was just like, man, I haven't watched this probably since it first hit DVD, and I wanted to check it out again. And it is a very good movie, very upsetting, very, very sprawling in the way that Scorsese movies can be. It's 3 hours long, spans, several decades. And I don't know that it's Leonardo DiCaprio's best performance, but it's probably his most acting with a capital A performance.
Okay.
Mostly because Hughes had so many tics and nervous habits and idiosyncrasies that he would express sometimes subtly and sometimes overtly that he has to embody, which must have been quite a task, but I think he pulls it off quite nicely. That's really what it is. He's in almost every shot of the movie. So if you enjoy seeing an actor trying to tackle a really difficult task and succeeding at it, it's good for that. I don't think it's Scorsese's top 5, but it is worthwhile for checking out, not only for DiCaprio as Hughes, but also Cate Blanchett as Katharine Hepburn. She's awesome in it.
I didn't even realize she was in it. I've never seen it. I guess I avoided it just for the generic reasons of, it's super long. People say it's not terribly focused as a story. Like you said, it's not. It's very sprawling and it's just a bunch of scenes from a life. So I guess I never felt like I had the patience to soak it in, but I am a fan of Leo and a fan of Scorsese. So one of these days I got to put that on.
Just, carve out a nice 3.5 hours because you probably have to take a couple breaks to get a snack and go pee or something.
Sure.
Who doesn't have 3.5 spare hours to just sit around and watch The Aviator?
Next time I'm on a plane, perhaps on a spruce goose, if you will.
There it is. Sure you haven't seen the movie? Spruce Goose. It's a big part of it.
Is it?
I know that was, yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. I've seen the Spruce Goose. I've not seen the movie. It used to be parked in Long Beach next to the Queen Mary.
Where's it now? It's in a museum?
Oh, I don't know.
What museum is big enough for it?
I don't know. It might still be there. I just feel like that was so long ago, and I haven't heard anyone say those words since the 80s when it arrived in LA and it used to get advertised on TV. Go see the Spruce Goose.
It's in McMinnville, Oregon right now.
It moved.
Yeah, it's on the move. Did it fly there? It has not been on display in Long Beach since 1992.
Okay.
So, yeah.
See, I'm a little out of date, but
yeah, it's parked up in Oregon. So if you're ever visiting the Pacific Northwest, go check out the Spruce Goose. It's not even the biggest. It was the biggest plane like in the world until 2019.
Really?
Which is pretty insane considering it was built in the 40s.
That is. So. And when you see some of those photos on the internet of ginormous Russian cargo planes, that's wild.
The largest wingspan of any aircraft that had ever flown until the scaled composites stratolaunch.
Look at what you can learn on the blast zone.
Right? See? It's made entirely of birch.
Oh, it's not spruce at all. It's just
not even spruce.
The birch lurch didn't go over as well as the name.
That was pretty solid. You just came up with that on the fly. Because it was a senator who coined the spruce goose term, and it was like a disparaging term. So the birch lurch is actually pretty good. That fits.
Yeah. You're trying to shit on a big old wooden plane.
Well done, Ian. Speaking of shitting on a big old wooden plane, no, I've got no segue for that. We're talking Sorcerer today. So this is, I'm fairly certain, the oldest movie we ever covered on the Blast Zone. I went back through real quick.
Yeah.
1977. Not our first Friedkin. We covered Blue Chips already back about a year ago.
Strange set of bookends. Very different Friedkin movies.
Blue Chips doesn't feel like a Friedkin movie to me at all.
No.
But this one most certainly does.
This one's right in line, and we'll talk about his history leading up to this. And those feel like a piece, and Blue Chips is somewhere off the map.
Yeah, Blue Chips felt like a money job. And this one is not trying to hide that it's a Friedkin movie because he keeps fucking popping Pazuzu into shots.
Yeah. Pazuzu is kind of the patron demon of this podcast. We just found out this week. Should we open the can of Pazuzu right now?
Let's do it. Let's get it all out in the open. First of all, I have to comment on my own run-in with Pazuzu last weekend.
Yeah, this sparked the new round of Pazuzu. Tell us what happened.
So I talked about it during our Crank episode. My plan was to go to Queens for the day and hang out with some friends, see my sister for her birthday. And we went to one of my favorite restaurants. If you're in the Queens area, it's in Bayside, Queens, called Press 195.
Okay.
And they had a new menu item. It was like a pulled pork with bacon, Monterey Jack cheese, red onions, cherry peppers. It was on a seated hero. It was phenomenal.
Sounds great.
But it was called the Pazuzu Pork Hero. And I said, this is a sign. We'd already decided we were doing Sorcerer next, but now there's no way around it. And I sent it to Ian. I was like, look, fucking Pazuzu. He's popping up everywhere. And then Ian discovered another Blast Zone tie-in to Pazuzu.
Yeah, so Pazuzu came up in, I think, the Empty Man episode, right? Because there was some major Friedkin references made in that movie. Some iconography.
It came up more recently than that, too. I don't remember why, but I tried to guess the name of Pazuzu and see if I could remember it from memory.
Yeah, you just brought it up. We're saying something about The Exorcist, and you're like, oh, yeah, with Pazuzu. And I'm like, Pazuzu? That's like a...
Constantine. I think it was Constantine, because that would make sense with the demons.
Yes, okay. But you came up with the name. I was totally unfamiliar to me at the time. You Googled it, and you're like, no, I'm right. I had it exactly. You did. And then he started showing up in our lives. And then we look back. He actually showed up in, was it episode 5? So
Yeah.
all the way back, Godzilla King of the Monsters has an oblique Pazuzu Easter egg in it where you see the silhouetted statue that resembles what is definitely a Pazuzu statue in The Exorcist.
It's in Godzilla's little like underground lair where he goes to recharge, right?
Yeah, that lair which has a bunch of Mesopotamian architecture. There's a little Pazuzu there. And then lo and behold, we pull up Sorcerer, which despite the title is not a movie about the supernatural. But Friedkin is like, let me just throw some Pazuzu in there. I got really into him while I was making The Exorcist. So I'm going to make this movie kind of feature him too.
There's a dark undertone. There's like, I don't know why, but there was just something in the back of my mind telling me like, you have to put Pazuzu in all your movies. Pazuzu's gospel must be spread throughout the earthly realm. Wait, hold on a second, William Friedkin. Like, where are you getting these ideas from? Like, yeah, sometimes I'll just wake up in the middle of the night floating above my bed and I'll be like, I got to put Pazuzu in this movie. Something weird's going on here.
Yeah, so Pazuzu, based on my little bit of research, because we've been saying this word a lot of times now in the last
It's true. It's almost starting to feel like not a word anymore.
It's losing its meaning. Before its meaning is totally gone. I looked it up. Pazuzu is the name of a Mesopotamian wind god. And in The Exorcist, he's a terrifying demon in the very modern demonic possession sense. That movie defines the modern American concept of demonic possession. In ancient Mesopotamia, he was used as a symbol of protection. People wore little statues like the one we see around their necks, and they put them on their mantles in their houses to ward off other spirits because he was kind of like the badass wind god that kind of smashed the other wind gods when they would try to fuck with people.
Cool.
But he was also a scary wind god in himself. So if you found him in the wild, as our characters do in this movie, if you ran into him in the mountains, that would kind of be a bad experience. So
he protect, but he also attack.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's a very good modern summation of him.
Thank you. Putting my internet-addled brain to good use for a change. Pazuzu, protect Yuzu. Wow, this is going downhill fast.
So we'll see. Now that we've thoroughly introduced him and ran his name into the ground, he's still going to pop up a bunch in this movie, and we'll point out where we see him so that you can see him too if you decide to watch this.
Yeah, why don't you tell me a little bit about Sorcerer and your relationship to it when you first became aware of it? Do you remember much from its release? I know you were pretty young at the time, but was there anything about this movie that sticks out to you from its initial release?
Yeah, it didn't make a blip on its initial release. I think I learned about it maybe 10 years later when I was like a teenager and I had a friend who's like, Sorcerer, you got to see it. By that time, it was probably rentable on VHS. And so I sort of heard about the movie and, oh yeah, it's got this killer soundtrack, Tangerine Dream, and it's a kind of a badass 70s movie. So ever since then, 1987 or whatever, I've been meaning to watch it. A little bit of time passed.
Yeah, a little bit.
A few decades here and there.
My entire life.
And I finally got around to it. And it's good. But this is the first time. So I just knew about it for decades.
This isn't the first. You took it upon yourself to just watch it randomly a couple weeks ago without knowing that was on the schedule.
I got an accidental head start. Maybe some demon put the idea into my brain, but I just started watching it. I got about halfway through and I paused. And then last week's episode, I found out that we were doing it. So I'm like, okay. But I did half a watch. And then this week I finished it and did a second watch.
I think I became aware of Sorcerer at the same time I became aware of Heaven's Gate. Some article, maybe in Empire magazine, maybe on like the AV Club, about famous bombs and specifically how they tied into the auteur era of the 70s. And, you know, it was the first time where in Hollywood, the power lied with the creators, not the studios to some extent. Right. So these young guys, and you can count Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, Spielberg, Lucas, Michael Cimino, and of course, William Friedkin were some of the head guys in this, John Frankenheimer too, to some extent, that were leading this movement. But the studio notes and studio oversight exist for a reason. Sure, not every director would agree, but some of these guys got a little too crazy with power, let it go to their heads a little bit, and got carried away with some of their productions, as we'll talk about in the future, I'm sure. Almost all those guys had a big, ambitious bomb at some point. This was one of the bigger ones. You know, Heaven's Gate is obviously the one that everyone refers to, but Sorcerer was pretty close behind it. Apocalypse Now was saved by being a hit movie, but it was damn near a disaster in its own right. And then Coppola had his own bombs later on. But so I sought it out after that, and I also sought out The Wages of Fear after that to kind of check that out as well. I fell in love with it immediately. It was already starting to get that kind of critical reevaluation that's been taking place for a lot of these 70s flops. Was already well underway for Sorcerer, and I went into it with that mindset. I was already a big fan of Tangerine Dream, so I was like, all right, cool. That's all I need to hear. I was a big fan of William Friedkin already. More his well-known movies, but the man's got some solid films under his belt. So I went into it and I dug it. It's very much a macho, like 70s movie, but we'll talk about it a little bit. It doesn't feel like a big movie, even though it cost $22 million before it was all said and done. It feels like a very tight, small, compact story, even though it's over 2 hours and had a big budget and some relatively big names working on it. It just feels like a pretty straightforward little story to me, which is kind of refreshing.
It's not showy in the way you said. If you're going to make a big budget thriller, action adventure movie in any decade, you would expect that movie to have more flash. And this movie has very little flash. And in fact, it starts with so little flash that it's disorienting. ending for the first half of the movie until you go, oh, yes, actually, this is an adventure thriller, but that's only the second hour of a 2-hour movie. But yeah, I feel like the money was spent well because the effects, the big, exciting action scenes are extraordinary. They're really good. But yeah, it doesn't sell itself to you when you're watching it as an action movie that spent a lot of money on itself. Everything is done very matter of fact. And so it's cool when you're ready for it, but it doesn't make a big impression necessarily.
I guess if you're judging it by its reputation, you'd be expecting an epic, and I don't think it's an epic necessarily.
Yeah.
But yeah, it has such an outsized reputation. And let's be honest, like film hipster circles, it's like a big film hipster favorite.
Because it is cool.
It's
cool. It's too cool for its own good. It's too cool for audiences, especially the way it gets started. But it's really rewarding. It's a movie where when you're ready for it, you can fall in love with it. And even after 2 watches, I'm like, oh, I want to go back and watch that scene again. I want to watch that scene again. It's a movie with a lot of staying power and a lot of quality that makes you can really fall in love with it. But at the same time, I can just absolutely see why general public would go in and go, what is this? I'm not getting it, and just be quite cool to it because the movie's kind of cool to us.
Do you want me to talk about the movie and the audience's response to it and maybe some of the reasons why they weren't quite ready for it?
Yeah, tell us what happened.
All right. William Friedkin was on a bit of a hot streak in the 70s. After the critically lauded but financially unsuccessful 1970 drama The Boys in the Band, he would release smash hit The French Connection in 71 and super mega smash hit The Exorcist in 1973. To quote another movie podcast, he now had a blank check to make whatever dream project he wanted.
It's a good thing they never bounce, baby.
Friedkin wanted to direct what he called, and I quote, a little $2.5 million in-between movie, end quote, before tackling his planned Exorcist follow-up, The Devil's Triangle. He settled on a reimagining of 1953 French thriller The Wages of Fear, which featured the same basic story of 4 down-on-their-luck men being hired to drive trucks full of unstable nitroglycerine from point A to point B. Friedkin started from scratch with the protagonists and the circumstances that brought them to Porvenir, the fictional Colombian town the film takes place in that seems to be kind of a haven for men on the run. As the scope of the film widened, Friedkin wanted an all-star cast to ensure audiences would turn up. He originally wanted Steve McQueen, Marcello Mastroianni, and Lino Ventura to be cast, but McQueen did not want to leave his wife Ali McGraw and lobbied for her to be given a producer role or to have a part in the film be written for her. Friedkin declined, and McQueen opted not to do the movie despite loving the script.
Friedkin should have bit the bullet and not let McQueen make a great escape.
Ventura had originally accepted the role of Victor Manzin, but dropped out following McQueen's refusal to join the cast. Mastroianni had to decline due to custody issues with his daughter. Roy Scheider, who Friedkin had worked well with on The French Connection, was cast as the lead role of Jackie Scanlon, and Bruno Cremer was cast as Manzin in his first English-speaking role, with Francisco Rabal, Amidou, Hamon Bieri, and Carl John rounding out the rest of the small cast. With the cast in place and a reported $15 million budget secured, filming commenced in the jungles of the Dominican Republic and Mexico in April of 1968. With a massive 10-month shoot, the movie seemed cursed from the get-go, both by the elements and Friedkin's frequent clashes with his cast and crew. Friedkin dismissed his first cinematographer, Dick Bush, after determining the jungle scenes were too dark, and replaced him with John M. Stevens.
That's right, Dick Bush got pulled out and John Stevens came in for sloppy seconds.
Friedkin also clashed with the Teamsters representative and had to find another trucker crew, in addition to firing 5 production managers throughout the shoot. The shoot was almost shut down in Mexico when cops warned Friedkin that several of his crew members were in possession of narcotics and had to leave the country or face jail time. This led to a 2-week delay while the entire crew was replaced. About 50 people had to leave the production due to injury, gangrene, malaria, and food poisoning, even including Friedkin, who lost 50 pounds and only discovered he had contracted malaria after the film's premiere. The production delays had ballooned the budget to $22 million, meaning it would need to be a sizable hit to turn a profit. With a June 24th, 1977 release date set, Sorcerer had a few obstacles standing in its way. First up was Star Wars, which had been released a month earlier and was a massive surprise hit. Audiences were still turning out en masse for the sci-fi epic and could not be persuaded to check out Sorcerer instead.
You don't need to see Sorcerer. This isn't the film you're looking for.
Another issue was the title. Friedkin was best known for The Exorcist, and audiences may have been confused about what kind of movie they were signing up for. Clarifying ads had to be run, which indicated Sorcerer was not a film about the supernatural, but the damage may have been done already. It was also theorized that Universal and Paramount co-distributing the film heard it, as neither studio really took the marketing and advertising reins, and the film therefore had a subpar advertising campaign. And indeed, the movie flopped hard, earning only $9 million worldwide before leaving theaters and receiving pretty mixed reviews. It was pretty quickly forgotten, except as a cautionary footnote, but has earned a massive critical reevaluation in recent years, now considered by many to be a masterpiece and one of the best movies of the 1970s.
A lot to talk about in there. Can we just jump back to gangrene?
Yeah.
You just kind of slip that in on the list of reasons people had to leave the production. I get injuries.
Not the Jets' defensive line either. We're talking about the real...
That's right. The bad kind of gangrene. Injuries, sure, you understand that. Malaria, food poisoning, all those things you can expect to happen on a set, a foreign country, a film with a bunch of complex and dangerous stunts. Gangrene is something that happens when you don't treat injuries. Like, that means people were getting hurt and then lying in mud for a week, and then they're like, oh, my arm is rotting off. I have to leave the show.
Isn't moisture like one of the big enemies of gangrene? Or not enemies, but one of the things that can lead to it?
Yeah, I guess. If you're in a rainforest, it's harder to keep your wounds clean and dressed. But
yeah, they should have been sent home when they were injured in the first place.
That screams, neglect. Like, go to the medic tent at least and wash your boo-boos and don't let them fucking rot your limbs off. That's scary.
It is scary. But what we learned about Friedkin in the Blue Chips episode is he runs his film sets in kind of a scary way, even when they're relatively low stakes movies like that. And you punch one of his actors or slap him at least.
Yeah, that was bad shit from the Blue Chips episode. And he was like, I was trying to motivate him to get more intense in the scene. I was like,
That was just an excuse like actors used and directors in the 70s and 80s to be complete dickheads to everyone.
Yeah.
Trying to get the best performance. Fuck yourself, man.
Be a decent person.
Yeah, how about that? Never heard about Greta Gerwig slapping anybody? No, I don't know what that. You could just cut that.
Let's hope we don't.
Yeah, so quite a disastrous filming there. Not quite on par with Apocalypse Now necessarily, but even The Deer Hunter was famous for having a ton of issues filming in the Philippines.
Oh.
Or no, they weren't in the Philippines. They were in Thailand. Apocalypse Now was in the Philippines.
Okay.
So it was like the thing in the 70s. You go to the jungle, you have a terrible time, you lose your mind a little bit, and then you come home with a masterpiece.
I guess it worked out good, but yeah, it was rough. I heard a thing with Roy Scheider saying how rough this filming was, and I felt worried for him in certain scenes of this movie where he's having to play his character, losing it, going nuts with frustration. And the man is swinging a machete around in a wonderful acting performance. But I'm like, that guy's about to cut a fucking finger off. I hope that thing isn't sharpened because it looks scary as shit.
Yeah, there are some scenes where you're like, he can't fake crazy eyes that good. He's probably really losing it. It was, by all accounts, just a torturous shoot. They had pretty much no stunt doubles. They were required to all do their own stunts.
Oh, boy.
Like the most famous scene in the movie, driving the truck across a drawbridge that is unstable. Like, they drove that fucking thing across an unstable drawbridge. Like, it fell in the water a bunch of times, apparently.
Oh,
it
shit.
took hours to set the shot up again after that happened.
Yeah, there's some level of trickery because I heard that bridge discussed as having a bunch of hydraulics connected to it. And that's part of the story of the production is that they built it in one location and the river dried up, so they had to move it and reconstruct it. So it wasn't just an old rope bridge that they found. It's not quite that insane, but there was some real danger because it was an actual bridge over an actual river and it looks pretty fucking dangerous.
Yeah, the first one they built, I think, was in the Dominican Republic.
Okay.
And it was too dry. There wasn't any water underneath it. So that one cost $1 million. So it was just $1 million down the drain. And then I think they built it in a jungle in Mexico for $3 million because it was a similar landscape, but it had more water there to make it a little more believable. $4 million. And it took, I think, 2 months to film that sequence.
It's kind of worth it, though. I hate to say that because we're just talking about maintain your decency and don't push the boundaries of humanity and personal safety to achieve results on screen. But they achieve some pretty rad results on screen. The bridge crossings are incredible to watch.
12 minutes of the movie, which is a big chunk to cross a bridge, but you're just on the edge of your seat the entire time, gripping whatever you can grip to white knuckles. But I thought it was funny that, so Friedkin originally wanted Robert Mitchum in the movie. I'm not sure for what role. Some speculate the Scheider role, but he was a little older, so I'm thinking it might have been the Nilo role.
Okay.
But Robert Mitchum said they were originally planning to shoot in Ecuador, which will make this make sense. He said, why would I want to go to Ecuador for 2 or 3 months to fall out of a truck? I can do that outside my house, which good for fucking Robert Mitchum. It ended up being a lot longer than 2 or 3 months. He had the right idea.
You talked about Steve McQueen. He's the kind of guy who would have relished doing his own stunts and in fact not have it any other way. So he was a perfect fit for this. Friedkin in every interview talks about, oh man, Roy Scheider was my second choice.
Friedkin loves shitting on Roy Scheider.
He does. He loves shitting on Roy Scheider and pumping up Steve McQueen, who really wanted to do it but had some demands, and Friedkin says he recognizes his own arrogance in not being willing to meet Steve McQueen on any of those demands, which is, I don't know, I get it. Steve McQueen didn't want to leave the U.S. He's like, you can find a jungle somewhere on the continent. And Friedkin was like, no, it's got to be real.
You kind of can't.
Yeah, I don't know about the locations are fantastic, and the texture of this movie, those helicopter shots and stuff are phenomenal. But then Friedkin also says, we talked about the box office in the monologue, he's like, Steve McQueen could have opened this movie, and Roy Scheider absolutely was not capable of opening doing this movie, and he thinks that was a big difference maker.
Roy Scheider's a fucking fantastic actor.
So good.
We have talked about him before. Briefly, he was the dad of the Punisher.
Yes.
Which gives you an idea of maybe how Sorcerer impacted his career in the long run, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But he's fucking phenomenal in this movie.
He stood out in that movie because there was a lot of terrible acting and terrible dialogue, and he still...
Especially in the sequence that he's in there. Like, that was where all the bad acting really was.
He was surrounded by some of the worst crap, and still you're like, oh, that guy has presence. And I think he's great in this. He has a vulnerability that I think Steve McQueen didn't have, and so I love what he brings to this role because he's a guy that you can just put a camera on his face and you feel for him.
He's got a droopy dog quality to him.
Such an emotive face, and it really works well for the part that he plays because he plays a guy who's, a hard luck dude, man. He didn't fuck up that bad personally, but his life got ruined, and so it's nice that you can feel for him, and I think Roy Scheider really helps that.
I think Steve McQueen's just a little pretty for the role too. He would stand out too much in that town. And also I just don't buy him as this kind of rough and tumble gangster from New Jersey. Whereas Scheider, you could see being like a low level kind of hood a little more so.
Exactly. His vulnerability really works for that character.
I don't know. We're talking around the story a lot. Do you want to get into the story of the movie a little bit?
Let's start the truck and see where it takes us. Around the world, the lives of 4 separate men take dramatic turns. In Veracruz, Mexico, an assassin named Nilo shoots a man in cold blood. In Jerusalem, a Palestinian named Qasim takes part in a terrorist bombing. His co-conspirators are quickly captured or killed by the authorities, but Qasim narrowly escapes. In Paris, a businessman named Victor is accused of a multi-million-dollar fraud. His father-in-law refuses to bail him out, and his business partner brother-in-law kills himself. Meanwhile, in Elizabeth, New Jersey, a small-time Irish mobster named Jackie Scanlon, played by Roy Scheider, helps rob an Italian-American Catholic church, taking $60,000 in bingo money that had been collected from local parishes. When a backseat fight breaks out between his mob compatriots, Jackie crashes the getaway car, and he's the only survivor of the bloody wreck. Which might seem like good luck, except that during the church robbery, a priest was shot, and that priest's brother, a mafia boss, vows to kill Jackie no matter where he tries to run.
Very good summation of a lot of stuff happening. At first, I was like, are we watching The Gray Man? We're just globe-trotting. Every new shot, there's a location at the bottom of the screen. I'm like, we're in Paris, we're in Jerusalem, we're in Veracruz. We're all over the map. And then beautiful Elizabeth, New Jersey.
Yeah, it's definitely where some of the money went because they didn't fake those locations. It's an interesting movie. It's hard to get into because it runs through these locations really one after another with no explanation except, like you're saying, those little texts at the bottom of the screen. It tells you just switch cities. Like, okay, wait, why are we in Paris now?
Right. There's no indication for how these characters are connected, if they are connected at all, what the kind of through line between them is. Of course, it all becomes obvious later, but that's confident filmmaking, the type of which I don't think we really see much of anymore because it would have gotten noted to death. But in the 70s, when the studios were giving all the power to the auteurs, they'd be like, oh, we trust you. And it makes for an interesting and exciting sequence.
Each sequence on its own is interesting. They get longer as they go. The Nilo scene is very short. He walks into a room, shoots a guy, walks back out. The Jerusalem scene is more challenging because our protagonists in this scene are Palestinian terrorists and they're bombing a public place and it's pretty brutal. The first explosion of the movie in a movie that loves its explosions.
And does them well.
Does them really well. What did you make of that when that's one of our people we meet?
I was confused at first about what's going on here. And then the blast and the reaction to it was so visceral, and come to find out, I guess there was a real bombing that happened while they were setting up for the fake bombing. So Friedkin took the opportunity to film some of the response to that.
Jeez.
I know you had a similar question about the scene though, which is how do they get caught so fast? It seems like they get away pretty okay from the actual scene of the crime. They're in disguise. They're dressed like young Jewish men. They get on public transit. They seem like they're in the clear, but then
kind of home free. Yeah.
The Israeli military just closes in on them like lightning fast.
And you're tempted to think, oh, did a bunch of time pass? But they're still in real time in that situation where they just got back to their apartment headquarters and they're hustling around planning their getaway out of the country or out of town at least. And then, all of a sudden, a bunch of Jeeps pull up outside their house and there's a massive gun battle and only Qasim gets away alive.
There's a few things in this movie that they don't explain for you. And we'll get into some of the other curiosities that mostly come up in the second section, I think. But I assume it just wasn't narratively important to Friedkin to include a line about how that happened.
Yeah.
But you certainly feel Qasim's desperation at that moment and his sadness at watching his friends and compatriots get killed or arrested.
Yeah, there's a lot of emotion in that short scene. And again, almost wordless. The Veracruz scene, there's no word of dialogue spoken. The Jerusalem scene, there's one line, but it's just a practical thing about we're taking this road versus that road on our getaway. Right. It's nothing about the characters personally. And so it's, these are like, they're not silent because the sound in this movie is actually one of its standout aspects. There's beautiful sound effects work. There's just textures to the backgrounds. The sound is very immersive and it's very evocative. evocative, but it's almost wordless until the third vignette when we get to Paris and people start talking and exchanging ideas and telling us who they are.
But talking in French. So everything up to this point's been subtitled. And apparently that was a sticking point for audiences too. They thought the guy who made The Exorcist is making this big thriller. And then we're almost 20 minutes into the movie and no English has been spoken yet. I think some audiences walked out, which like just fucking grow up, read some dialogue. But I think that was a bigger barrier to entry for people at the time. Like I think subtitles have gotten a little more normalized now.
Yeah. And like I get it. If you went in thinking you're seeing an action movie, or especially if you think you're seeing a supernatural movie about sorcerers and demons, perhaps, you'd be like, I walked in the wrong theater. This is a foreign film in Paris and Jerusalem. But also if the movie was more conventional, if it didn't actually have two full scenes where nobody tells you shit, by the time they started speaking French, you might have been okay with it. But at this point, it's definitely tests your patience, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. But that being said, Victor's conversation with his wife is just beautifully done. The dialogue is so wonderfully written.
Yeah.
And the story about this book she's reading. And she says something at the end of their conversation there where Victor asks, she was talking about a soldier who had a chance to kill a bunch of people. Long story short, he says, did he go through with it? And she said, yes. He says, well, he's just another soldier then. And his wife says, nobody is just anything. And Friedkin singled that one line out, which is not even spoken in English. And is kind of before we understand what the movie is even going to be about, as saying like that's the thesis of the film, that all these men from these disparate places who seem like fuck ups and like they're on their way out can still seize their destiny to some extent.
The stuff they talk about in that scene is very evocative. And you could say, okay, he's talking about the idea that these men, these mistakes they made in their lives or the situations that they got into really changed their world, but they don't have to be defined by those things and they can reinvent themselves. I don't know. Is that what they do?
Do they reinvent themselves? Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of them seem to be relying on the skills they acquired in their old life to succeed, quote unquote, in this new world.
Like, to me, the plot ends up being this action movie plot where it does a lot of work to set you up that, yes, these men are terribly desperate. And we'll get to that in the second section of the movie where their desperation sinks in even further. But then it just becomes like a question of what if we forget everything and it's just about surviving and getting to your destination? And it's kind of about the mechanics at that point. I don't know.
It's a bit of a procedural.
Yeah, I have a hard time drawing a lot out of what Friedkin seems to say this movie is about, which is fate, destiny, people defining themselves and defying those definitions.
In fact, I would almost openly disagree with him. Based on the final shot of the movie, which we'll talk about when the time comes, I think the real message of this movie is you can't escape your past.
Which is fine, too. If you ask that question and you go, maybe not, that's definitely one of the meaningful things to take from this movie. But yeah, it's not an optimistic version of his question.
And it's contradictory to his own kind of statement about the movie. But, you know, he gave more interviews about this movie when he was like 30 years removed from it than he did around the time because nobody gave a shit when it was coming out. So he had 30 years to think about it and reflect on it. And he also probably got older and a little less cynical.
That's true. Let's hope.
Let's hope.
Before we leave this first section of the movie, we neglected to call out that we have a Pazuzu sighting. The very first thing you see in this movie, the title card, the word sorcerer, is over something dark in the background, and it's a stone idol with a demonic face. And that's one of our Pazuzus that haunt us throughout this movie, in this podcast.
Pazuzu counter, that's one. Uno. Pazuno.
Pazuzu counter 1. Explosion counter 1. Are we ready to move on to Act 2?
I guess we are. Let's go. Welcome to Porvenir, a remote and extremely impoverished village in the wilds of Colombia. Cassim, Victor, and Jackie have all taken up residence here under assumed names and false papers. And given the pitiful wages they can earn working around town, the men have little hope of ever affording to leave. Jackie works at the town's tiny dirt airstrip where we see the assassin Nilo arriving in town on unknown business. But the main employer in the area is an American oil company until one day the local oil well catches fire. The only way to put out the fire and rescue the local economy is with dynamite. And the only supply of dynamite is 200 miles away and so poorly maintained, the slightest bump will make it explode. So the company hires our 4 protagonists, the only men both capable and desperate enough to drive the deadly cargo to its destination. But before they can start their journey, the men must cobble together a pair of roadworthy trucks from scrapyard parts. I did want to say the first time I watched this movie, I was blown away by how much the TV show Lost lifted from this.
Oh, really?
They had a long arc, maybe 2-3 episodes of them picking up a bunch of dynamite from one place that had been sweating nitroglycerin for years and years and years, and carrying it in backpacks across the island to the other side of the island. And you know, it has the one guy, Arts, his name was, who knows about nitroglycerin and is trying to be very cautious. And of course, he explodes pretty early on.
Okay.
But clearly, like, I hadn't seen Sorcerer when I was watching Lost. And then when the first time I watched Sorcerer. I was like, fucking lost. It's a Sorcerer reference.
There you go. Yeah, and this section of the movie are 4 guys from these random vignettes we watched for the first 24 minutes of the film. Suddenly they're in the same place. Okay, now we start to see it. And by the end of this section, they are the 4. Actually, they're not. 3 of them are the guys that have won the contest to drive these trucks. And the other guy, Nilo, is just still lurking in the background and giving everybody the evil eye.
What is Nilo doing there? Is he blowing up the well? That was my one theory, because they never really tell us who blew up the well. We know it was terrorists, quote unquote.
Right.
But Nilo's there. We don't know who he's there to kill. We know he's an assassin by now. But we don't know who he's there to kill, and we don't know why he stays.
Yes.
For so, like it's very unclear his role in this whole thing.
He sticks out because he's not poor and desperate. He comes into town. He's flashing money at the immigration official to let him sneak in without proper papers. He's still got his shiny white shoes. He is not like the other guys. And so, yeah, it looks like he's just passing through to do a hit. And you wonder about Jackie, because Jackie seems like our mainest of main protagonists. And like, you wonder, was Nilo hired to come down and off him? But if so, that didn't make it to the final cut. I heard that there was quite a bit more dialogue shot that didn't make it, and a lot more between Nilo and Jackie. And the 2 of them end up in a truck together. So it feels loaded, like there's supposed to be some confrontation between the 2 of them, but they end up being just ordinary tension of the trip and nothing related to their backgrounds.
Yeah, we never really get the story on Nilo. That's another filmmaking choice. It's not like it ruined my immersion in the movie, but I couldn't help but wonder every time I saw him, what the fuck is he doing?
Yeah. And
what's he up to?
Like, he maneuvers to get onto the crew, but it's like he didn't seem to be stuck in town. Like the other guys are clearly stuck, and they do vignettes in town. Similar to the first act, they do a vignette with each guy to show, here's why you're dirt poor and you're never getting out. And each one like tries their little move. Victor tries to pawn his watch, and the guy's like, nah, it's not enough. And Jackie Scanlon gets this whole scene where the corrupt local cops take his papers and basically extort 1/3 of his wages for the rest of his time there, as if he was already not poor enough. So it's driving home just how screwed these guys are, and they're never getting out of this town. But not Nilo.
And am I supposed to believe that French prison is worse than what Victor is doing here in Porvenir? Like,
yeah,
he's working in the oil field. He's basically in a jungle prison.
Yeah.
He can't leave. He's not making any money. He's never going to be able to buy his way out of there. He works a shit job for shit pay. Like, it's white collar crime. How long were you going to be in prison for? You're probably better off just toughing it out.
It does stand out because, yeah, he's the only guy who hasn't directly or indirectly killed someone. Although he kind of killed his brother-in-law by pushing him, by being the leader of this embezzlement plan, and then pushing his brother-in-law, like keep telling him to go back to his dad, who's Victor's father-in-law, to bail them out. And he's like, no, he already told me it's not happening. He's letting us go down. And then brother-in-law kills himself, and Victor just kind
of bails,
runs out of the parking lot of this fancy restaurant. Like, did he run to South America? You never get to find out. But yeah, it does seem like he could have. I guess the reasoning or the justification that was in the script was that he fucked up his family so bad. This father-in-law,
because it's all intertwined.
Yeah, it's his wife's father. And if the first scene goes into just how devoted he and his wife are to each other, and she gives him this watch, which is a symbol of her through the rest of the movie. They have this interesting conversation. Like, he just fucked that up, their 10-year marriage.
And her brother is dead now.
Her brother is dead. Her
because
father's
of him,
business is ruined, and it's all his fault. So I can get leaving town, but man, I don't know. Go somewhere nicer.
Yeah, it's got to be somewhere else. So then we should talk about the well exploding, because we're keeping track of all the explosion shots. This is pretty massive. Pretty impressive explosion here.
Super cool. I mean, not a great thing to happen. There's a lot of guys working on that well when it exploded, but a really impressive giant explosion. And then the part that I like even better about this explosion is that in a following scene, the company's expert comes and tours it with a helicopter, and you see how much they really did this on location. It's this oil well in the middle of the jungle, and it looks like a real oil well burning. How do you simulate that on a movie budget? It's just this enormous fountain of flame erupting out of the ground, shot from a real helicopter flying overhead. It looks amazing. I don't know how they did it.
Sometimes the simplest answer is the correct one. They might have just done it.
Did they drill for oil though? Like, how did they, or did they?
Yeah, I don't know how they kept it burning like to that degree, but
yeah,
that's a real fire going on in the middle of the jungle.
Yeah.
There's no way they had the technology to fake it. I don't know. That's why it feels like a small story, because the location doesn't really change all that much once they're in Colombia.
Mm-hmm.
And the story is pretty straightforward, but that's where I guess the epicness does leak through, is in these just set pieces that are so like overwhelming.
The danger feels real. You got to give the movie a ton of credit for really making that stuff feel real.
Because it was. Can you imagine if John Landis directed this? How many people would have died?
Don't even want to think about it. But yeah, there's other shots with the explosions where they all, again, take long shots from like the next mountain over. And you're like, oh yeah, they really fucking blew something up. And it was big.
Now, you had a good point here about the old dynamite that I wanted to touch on, because I don't want to be one of those podcasts where we just call out quote unquote plot holes the whole time.
Yeah.
But wouldn't it just been cheaper to buy some new dynamite and fly it in?
Is there no fresh dynamite in South America? Because that scene we talk about where you get that amazing shot of the oil well, there's this guy who didn't seem to be part of the local crew of the American oil company. He's flying in to inspect the dynamite, give his opinion. He's flying a helicopter in. Then there's another helicopter pilot that the company man is talking to afterwards. They're spending a lot of money to analyze the problem and figure out how to solve it. But couldn't somebody have gotten on a plane or helicopter with some fresh dynamite that's safe to travel with and just dropped it off, and maybe the rest of the movie wouldn't have had to happen?
And we know they didn't need all that much, because when Jackie, spoiler alert, makes it back to the well, he's got one box in his hands.
He got one box out of the six.
Out of the six that they had when they started this journey. And they call that out in this section of the movie. They say, oh, you have 2 trucks. You only need 1.
Right.
This is because you don't think we're both going to make it.
True.
So you mean somebody couldn't get like 8 sticks of dynamite into South America for cheaper than this whole excursion?
They promised these guys a big sum of money, these huge paychecks. I don't know.
20,000 pesos. Yeah. They might have been planning to stiff them or something. Who knows?
I don't know. They come through in the end. So I'm like, yeah, they spent a lot of money for quite an elaborate scheme when maybe there was a better way to put out this fire. But we got a good movie out of it, so we shouldn't complain too much.
I love the truck montage of them working on the trucks and driving the trucks.
Yes.
That's super fun to me. It feels like a putting the team together, except they're putting the truck together. But they're also putting the team together to some extent.
They do these tryouts before they have to build their trucks. They get these tryouts, and it's all of a sudden the movie has a sense of humor. We said it's kind of cold and distant and mysterious in a 70s thriller kind of way. And all of a sudden it's good time fun. They're like, we need truck drivers. And they rig up this truck, and the company guy, what's his name? Corlett is the company man. He's a very sympathetic guy. The company is not sympathetic, but the one sort of foreman on site is just a good guy. And he's like, I got to hire some dudes to drive these trucks. And he piles all the people who want to try out in the back of the truck. So it's a really funny scene already, because it's like a montage, bunch of different guys behind the wheel, and they each do something funny or different in the way they approach the truck. And he's like, no, pull over. You're done. You failed your driving test kind of thing. And then they show that the rest of the guys are in the back of the thing. And there's a guy like popping the clutch, jerking the truck around. The guys are falling down and corrugated tin panels are falling off. It's the funniest part of the movie. And it really warms you up to the movie at this point.
Yeah. It's the last break we get before this journey into hell starts.
Yeah. It gets deadly serious after that.
Which is the rest of the movie. We'd be remiss if we didn't mention one last thing before we move on to the second half of the last third, but also the second half of the movie. The movie's structured weird. Who do we see towards the end of the second section of the movie?
Pazuzu? Did he come back?
He pops up. He's on one of the trucks. He's the devil on the hood of the Sorcerer.
You alluded to the truck building. There's 2 montages. There's this truck tryout montage, and then it segues into this truck building montage where it gets very serious, but like almost in an 80s A-Team way, right? All of a sudden they're welding hoods onto trucks and timing the valves and doing all this kind of stuff that you didn't know these guys had any skills to do, but they're plundering this scrapyard, and they build these 2 awesome looking trucks. The production design of the trucks are another one of the triumphs of the movie. They just look cool and really special.
Fucking sweet. Yeah.
Yeah. They're each unique, and they're these Frankenstein monsters. I think they have these aspects to them. Lazaro, the green truck, which is the one that Jackie drives, is not as special looking, but it does have these eyes painted on a wooden board above the cab that are real subtle and faded and cool. And then Sorcerer, the red truck, driven by Victor and Qasim, has this killer grill that's like right out of a Stephen King, Christine kind of thing. Like it's a truck that feels alive.
It's got teeth.
It looks like it's grinning at you.
Evil.
And then they give a close-up shot on the hood, and there's a little devil man painted on the hood. There's our guy Pazuzu.
Pazuzu's back again. Pazuzu 2. Pazuzu 2. Pazuzu. Oh, that's a good one. That's a good one.
Yeah. Instead of one of the Z's, it's number 2. Love it.
Please leave all this in. And
all right, shall we hit the road, or do we have more to talk about?
I think we're good to go. Yeah.
All right. The journey has begun. Our 4 protagonists carefully navigate their 2 trucks over crumbling roads, through driving rain, and around mischievous locals. Then, in the worst storm, each truck must cross an impossibly swaying rope bridge over a raging river. They make it, but soon find an enormous fallen tree blocking their path. Using his bomb skills, Qasim helps them clear the tree with one of the boxes of dynamite. But later, bad luck claims Victor and Qasim as their truck blows a tire, falls down a steep cliff, and explodes. Then, when the other truck stops to look, rebels pop out and try to hijack them. Nilo and Jackie fight off the rebels, but Nilo is shot and dies soon after. Jackie drives on, eventually abandoning the truck in a daze of exhaustion and walking the final 2 miles to successfully deliver a single box of dynamite. The well is extinguished, oil starts flowing again, and Jackie is a hero amongst the local villagers. But just as Jackie is receiving his reward from Corlett, a trio of New Jersey Mafia henchmen arrive in town and seal his fate.
quite a bleak ending.
It is.
Things considered.
At the last moment of the film, like you just had this sort of triumphant thing, but Roy Scheider's face kind of hints that he's not all that happy. Like he survived it. They're hooking him up.
His body survived it, but yeah, you get the sense that he's a broken man now.
Kind of a broken man, and I guess he doesn't have to live in that state very long because he's done.
They don't really leave much to the imagination. You see the guys get out of the car and you're like, okay. Then you also hear the gunshot off screen.
You do. I didn't hear it the first time. I heard it on the rewatch. It's this distant shot from overhead, and there's a lot of, again, like most of the movie, there's a lot of atmospheric ambient sound of this village going on from the outside of this bar. And then there's this little pop, and you're like, oh, yep.
How are those guys going to get out of the country now? Do they live there? Are they going to take like...
They're going to be the next set of truck drivers. Yeah, it doesn't necessarily even make sense because they went into a bar where the two cops were in that bar. The dirty cops who were now...
They're always in there, yeah.
Okay, with Jackie, were sitting in the bar. So how did they shoot Jackie with a single gunshot and get out of that bar alive? I don't know.
Unless they shot more than just Jackie.
Maybe.
But they did seem pretty dead set on getting him. But this section starts with Friedkin.
Yeah, Pazuzu shows up in the form of the stone demon that we saw under the main titles at the very beginning. Now he's in full daylight view. He's carved into some rocks on the side of the road as they start their journey. And it's like, okay, demon's going to be with us. This is not going to go easy.
Not a good omen. But then we talked about it a little bit. We have to talk about the fucking rope bridge because this has to be one of the more impressive sequences I can remember watching ever. It's just so spellbinding.
It's so good. It's tucked away in this movie that's a little dense and hard to get people to watch. But if you can open up to it, it's such a thrilling scene. It's as good as any. You think about, oh, what are the fun action scenes I've seen in Mission Impossibles or Indiana Jones or things like that? It's right up there. It's definitely one you put in your book of exciting things I've seen in a movie that blew my mind. And
did you have a book like that?
It's in my memory warehouse. It's not a real book.
Oh, okay. So it's all Stephen King scenes.
It's mostly Stephen King scenes. And this one just broke in because it's so cool. The way the trucks move on the bridge, it's terrifying. First, Jackie's truck goes across and you think that's harrowing. And it is. It's so freaky. The rain is pelting down, the sounds of their engines. And it's always like one guy driving and the other guy like crawling along these broken planks of the bridge. And like he's always in danger and the truck is about to fall off at any minute. It's so cool.
Just the degree to which this bridge is tilting and the truck is like at such a severe angle. It's mind blowing that they don't tip into the water, which I guess they did a bunch of times during filming.
Yikes. But they survived it. Thankfully, the actor survived it. The crew survived. Jackie gets across and you're like, that was really harrowing. And then they're like, hold my beer. Victor and Qasim are going to try it now. And it's like 10 times worse.
And fucking Qasim falls under the bridge, almost gets run over.
I was sure Victor was going to run him over. That bit of suspense is done so well. Victor's screaming out the window, I can't see you, I can't see you. And yet he's still pushing on the gas and rolling forward. And you're like, dude, stop. You're going to run over your dude. And then Qasim pops up and he's like, oh, I didn't see you. I thought you were a goner. And you have this moment of relief. And then this fucking haunted tree attacks. It's like out of Poltergeist.
It's the tree from Evil Dead, I think.
A horrific tree comes floating down the river and slams into them. And they spend another 5 minutes hacking away the tree, pulling this winch off this log that's about to tear the whole bridge down. It's unimaginably tense and cool.
Just such a iconic sequence. It's not a scene. It goes on for fucking 15 minutes, so you can't call it a scene. But it's just such a thrilling sequence. It's so well done. Really worth the price of admission alone. But there's lots of other good stuff in the movie, and we get one pretty close after this when you think they're in the clear. The sun is shining, at least. The weather's nice all of a sudden. And then they come upon a massive tree just down in the middle of their path, and there's no way around it. Yeah. This is the scene where I think you alluded to, where McQueen was like swinging a machete around, right?
Yeah. Scheider is swinging a machete because he loses it in this scene. He's like, all hope is gone. And he starts to talk crazy. And he's telling them, we got to go through the swamp. We've got to chop these trees down with our machetes. And it makes Nilo pull a gun on him and is like, fuck you, make your play, dude. I'm not going along with your crazy shit.
There's an interesting behind the scenes story about this tree detonation too. Did you happen to check out the note on this that I put in the one sheet?
Yes. Tell us that story. It sounds too good to be true, but this is how they actually blew up the tree, not how the characters blew up the tree.
Right. Yeah. This is a behind the scenes tidbit. Friedkin wasn't going to blow up a model. He wanted to blow up this massive fucking tree.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a Kyoba tree, apparently. If that means anything to our listeners. But so he wasn't sure he had adequate explosive power to actually blow this tree up in the spectacular fashion that he wanted and needed for the movie. So Marcel Vercatori, who was a special effects guy who worked with him on The Exorcist, was going to handle the explosion. It barely damaged the tree, apparently. Left a little scorch mark on it, but didn't blow it up like he needed it to. So Friedkin found some arsonist who went by the name Marvin the Torch Torch from my hometown of Queens, New York, flew him to the Dominican Republic 3 days after he got the call and just found flammable materials on set or from local suppliers, blew the fucking tree up in one take the next morning.
I don't know if I believe that went down like that because it certainly raises a lot of questions. Is he really an arsonist? Do you hire a guy who's not an actual movie technician, but just a wild man?
It's 1977, man. You probably do.
Maybe you do. Different times. But whatever he was, he did an excellent job. This is out of the 4, I think there's 4 explosions in this movie.
Yeah, if the truck comes later in this section too.
The visuals of seeing this tree explode on film was my favorite, just in terms of pure aesthetic of stuff blowing up. I'm not usually like connoisseur of things blowing up, but I became one during this movie, and this is my pick.
Now, hold on here. I Googled Marvin the Torch, and there was a Daily Beast article about him in 2017.
Oh, shit.
And I want to make sure this is the same guy I'm thinking of, because he's an arsonist, and maybe not him. I don't think I can find a real.
I see Jimmy Breslin talking about Marvin the Torch.
Isn't Jimmy? Yeah.
That's the guy from Summer of Sam.
Yeah, it is. Oh, so there's the New York connection. Maybe Marvin the Torch is real.
But
yeah,
I guess when Jimmy Breslin talked about him, people thought he was making him up too. I don't know if this guy's real. Holy shit. He does. There is a story online that Friedkin, like he was a real arsonist from Queens who would blow up businesses and collect the insurance.
So Marvin the Torch is a real guy.
And there's no explanation of how Friedkin knew him, but he like called him up. His wife answered and he got through to him. And
we're going to have to put this article in the show notes.
This is so weird.
Marvin the Torch is a real man. Fuck yeah. He's still alive? Shake his hand.
Good for him. He got a nice gig out of his reputation as an arsonist around New York City.
He's a master arsonist.
In the 70s.
How dare you question the validity of my research? This is what you get. Vindicated.
We think it's real. As much as anything you read on the internet seems real.
And then, so that's the third explosion. It's magnificent and just a real feel-good moment for the team. Kasim is able to rig up some crazy explosive Goldberg device, essentially, that works. It's just a real, like, a feel-good moment for him, and one of the few, because he blows up pretty much immediately following this.
You thought things were good when they got past the bridge, but it wasn't. There's this obstacle that brings them their lowest moment in the film. They almost all fight and kill each other. Then they get past that, and then they're actually kind of happy. And Victor and Kasim are trading stories and talking about home and Paris, and wouldn't you know it, that's when things go bad for them.
I don't mean to laugh, because it's not a funny scene, but like their tire blows, and there's just such like serenity on their faces as they go off the cliff.
I like that edit. They're talking, cuts to the tire pops, and then there's just a quick thing of both of their faces, like, what was that? And then they're off the cliff and then smithereens.
It just happens so casually, like it's so fast. Everything's going fine.
Yep.
And then, of course, the big explosion, another one, the final one of the movie.
Very cool. And that's the one where you see that long shot because Jackie and Nilo look up and they're like 10 minutes behind the guys and they see this big cloud of smoke coming off of the next ridge over. Really sort of brings home the reality of it.
And they go back for them.
Or forward. I feel like they were...
Oh, right.
They were behind, although it could have gone either way. They were stopped. They were filling their radiator. And then they go to this spot. And then that's where they get hijacked by some very sort of rebel-looking rebels. They've got little like berets and patches and some core of South American communist rebels, maybe.
Yeah, that's the vibe I got. They're pretty reasonable as far as rebels go. They're just like, hey, man, like we just want your stuff. We're not going to hurt you. But little do they know, the stuff is dynamite.
Nilo turns the tables. He starts shooting them.
Anyway, I started blasting. He went Danny DeVito on him.
It worked, except he gets shot. Scheider kills one of them with the shovel. But what's interesting to me in this scene is by the time these guys get hijacked, by the time the two guys, Nilo and Jackie, pull up to look at their remains of their compatriots, these guys look like ghosts. And I'm sure that's intentional. Like their faces are coated in dust. Their eyes are deep set. They were already around the bend and lost their humanity a little bit.
They've got to be sleep deprived, starving, thirsty, all the things you could be, all the negative things you could feel at that moment. They've got to be dealing with.
And then Pazuzu's there to wink at them one more time. The hood where his little symbol is painted on is like the only recognizable piece of the truck that blew up that's still there when they look down the side of the hill.
That's like a Pazuzu 3.5, we'll say.
Okay.
Yeah. And then we get Jackie just having full-on hallucinations as he tries to make the last few mile drive. He's melting down.
Nilo's dying on the floorboards next to him. And he starts to have flashbacks to his accident back in Elizabeth that started all this. And then the truck kind of runs out of gas, maybe. It doesn't really explain.
I think that's what happened. Yeah. Overheated or something.
Peters out.
Yeah.
And he just gets out and walks.
Like we said, even though he fulfilled his job and he gets all the rewards he was promised, he looks like he's never going to be the same.
No, he's not happy. Corletta gives him a check. And the check says $40,000. And that's really different probably than 40,000 pesos of whatever fictional version of Colombia this was.
Right.
And even that's not enough to make him happy. And he's like, I can't cash a check. And let's know, yeah, you can. You just go to company stores nearby and
They have $40,000 in cash.
they'll give you the cash right there. And he's like, still, everything's fucked up. My life is fucked. I'm going to have one last dance with the nice lady who works at the bar who wished us good luck when we left. And that's the last thing he does.
And he gets shot in the fucking head, probably. I don't know where they shot him, but I assume since we only hear one, it was the head. And that Sorcerer, kind of a bummer,
Yeah.
but really good.
Yeah, we liked it. It's a certain kind of a favorite. It just vaulted right into those ranks for me. I don't know when I'll revisit it, but a lot of scenes in this movie have a special place for me.
I might revisit scenes before I revisit the whole thing again. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's kind of that kind of thing.
There's definitely sequences in this movie I want to show people.
Yeah.
All right. So do we want to get into a little bit of the people involved in the making of the movie and what happened to them after?
Yeah, I hope they didn't fall off a cliff and explode.
We covered Friedkin in depth on the Blue Chips pod, so I don't want to devote too much time to him. But one big update since then, we all assumed he was retired because he's 87 years old. But he's apparently directing an adaptation of the play The Kane Mutiny Court-Martial
Okay.
into a movie starring Kiefer Sutherland.
I thought Kiefer Sutherland was retired, not to mention William Friedkin.
I don't think Kiefer Sutherland ever retired. I think people were like, you're retired, Kiefer Sutherland.
Okay.
It wasn't a choice so much as
An
a
intervention.
verdict. Yeah.
A verdict is good.
But apparently they're making this movie together as of August, maybe. I haven't heard anything about it since, but apparently he's coming out of retirement for that. And he's got a great filmography, not always regarded as the easiest man to work with in Hollywood, but if he retired tomorrow, or he would still have a very strong legacy.
Sure.
Let's be honest, he's probably going to die pretty soon. He's old as shit.
God bless him.
So unfortunately, the rest of the cast, our four main dudes, is also deceased. Or is deceased, not also.
Yeah.
So Roy Scheider he almost followed this up immediately with The Deer Hunter. He was supposed to be in The Deer Hunter.
Oh, wow.
But dropped out 2 weeks before filming to make Jaws 2 a much worse movie than The Deer Hunter, but pretty successful financially.
Yeah, you can't say no to Jaws 2, right? Jaws was a phenomenon.
And he'd get an Academy Award, Best Actor nomination for All That Jazz a few years later. So he wasn't complete, like Sorcerer didn't ruin his career, but he did lose some prestige. He started appearing in some more, not like sleazy movies, but just a little lower caliber.
Okay.
Although he would pop up in big Hollywood productions from time to time. Like he was in The Rainmaker, the Francis Ford Coppola movie.
Okay.
He was in The Peacekeeper. He was in The Punisher, other movies that are two-syllable words preceded by the. But he died in 2008 after a battle with cancer, unfortunately. So I think that might have had something to do with him slowing down later in his career.
Sorry to see him go. I'm going to have to go back and watch All That Jazz. That's another one that I remember the idea of it existing as a kid and maybe seeing snippets of it when it came to TV, but never watched that one. And
I don't think I did either.
now that I'm a bona fide Scheider fan, I got to go back and scoop that one up.
Yeah, who directed that? Bob Fosse.
Oh, Bob Fosse directed a movie about himself? That makes it even more crazy.
And he wrote it. He's out of control. So this was, like we mentioned, Bruno Cremer's first English-speaking role.
Okay.
And then most of his career was spent playing Commissaire Magritte on French TV, who was like a famous police officer character that spanned multiple shows and movies. And that was his like signature character, the same way like somebody would play Bond for a couple decades. And he did that before retiring in 2005 due to throat cancer, which made it hard for him to say his lines. And he passed away in 2010.
Okay.
And then Amidou, who played Nassim, he didn't work quite as much in his career, but he did pop up in a lot of movies. He was in a bunch of spaghetti westerns and some American productions like John Frankenheimer's Ronin, which is a baller-ass movie that we're going to have to cover one day.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Another movie with a really signature few action scenes that didn't get the love it deserved when it came out. He was in Tony Scott's Spy Game, which is a movie I completely forgot existed.
Okay.
And he died in 2013.
I like him in this. What's interesting is that you can tell that Friedkin likes faces almost to a fault, right? And we talked about how nonverbal the first act of this movie is a lot of just looking at faces. And it's interesting because Roy Scheider has that face that we said makes you just feel for him. Right. And I feel like Amidou has a similar kind of face, whereas the other two guys are cold and hard and are a little bit off-putting in their demeanor. Amidou has some of that Scheider thing where you're like, you see his face and you're just sympathetic to him for some reason. I like that.
And it's valuable because he's probably the character we're least likely to feel sympathetic towards, at least early on, because he does the most kind of heinous thing that ends him up in this town. So his expressiveness and the empathy you feel for him comes in super valuable. Otherwise, we just would have no connection to his character.
It makes it a great casting choice.
Francisco Rabal, who played Nilo, was just a constantly working actor in a lot of Spanish language movies. He wasn't as big a star in the U.S. Tragically died in a plane crash coming home from the Montreal Film Festival in 2001.
Oh my goodness.
Bad year to be on a plane. But he was the oldest of the cast, so all four of our truck drivers have since passed away, unfortunately. But Friedkin's still out there kicking.
Man, the wrath of Pazuzu. I hope it doesn't get us.
He said his name plenty of times. If it's like a Bloody Mary situation, we're fucked.
But if it's like we're honoring him, I don't know if it's like a Neil Gaiman American Gods thing.
Were we honoring him?
We're keeping his
This
name
feels like some
alive.
revisionist history. We are keeping his name alive for sure.
We are invoking his power. And so in the American God style, we are helping him not fade into nothingness.
Security. Fair. All right. Well, that was Sorcerer. Did you have any closing thoughts you wanted to get into?
Not a big closing thought, but I picked up another quote from the filmmaker this time, something that Friedkin said in one of the interviews that I tried to peruse. It was about the story of the movie and about its lack of success, which obviously he gets asked about a lot in every interview. And we talked about how Star Wars stomped this movie at the box office, but he ascribed some deeper significance to the fact and the way that Star Wars stomped this movie at the box office. Is he was like, people suddenly wanted comic book type stories. And he was basically saying that Star Wars was the cause of that. It's an interesting observation because we noted how 70s this movie feels, like renegade filmmaker 70s, and that it doesn't adhere to normal conventions. The act structure is weird. The movie gets going really slowly. It doesn't give you its action until the halfway point. But Friedkin was really, I guess, a defender of that very artistic vision of filmmaking. And he's like, nah, then Star Wars came along and everybody just wanted popcorn movies.
A similar argument is being played out in interviews and podcasts and everything right now with the rise of superhero movies in the past 15 years or whatever, becoming such like a massive industry, and the state the theater industry is in right now. There's a lot of directors kind of saying stuff along those lines, and maybe it's cyclical, but it feels like theaters are in a more dire place than they have been any time in my lifetime, at least.
Yeah.
I hope we can find a home for these type of movies that are a little more challenging narratively.
Yeah, I guess they probably just have to be made without $3 million bridges and $1 million explosions, because that's what you can't do without that big studio money.
And it feels very rare for a non-IP film to get a budget comparable to what Sorcerer got in 1977.
Yeah.
The good news is there's a lot of movies that have been made already that we haven't seen.
It's true.
If a lot of our listeners haven't seen Sorcerer, you could just go watch this. You don't have to lament movies not being made anymore.
Definitely watch it. This is one that I think both of us would say you got to see. So hopefully us talking about it will get some people to look for it.
I hope so. We've been doing some heavy stuff lately. The Princess Bride, Children of Men, Constantine, movies with big fan bases and kind of cult followings. But next week, I think we're just going to do a movie that I don't know that I've ever heard anyone talk about, even though it was a huge event when it came out and cost a ton of money. And I'm excited to watch it then. I never saw it. It was an adaptation of a game that I was very into for many years. We're doing WARCRAFT.
Oh my goodness. You dropped another bomb on me. I forgot to check the schedule.
I know.
I did not know what you were going to say. I played a little WARCRAFT in my time, World of Warcraft. I have no idea what to expect.
Duncan Jones was the son of David Bowie, for one thing, and also a director that was really a hot property in Hollywood at the time because he had directed Moon.
Yes.
The Sam Rockwell thriller / sci-fi drama that was really well received. And then Source Code, which was a Jake Gyllenhaal thriller that was well received. And then he followed up with WARCRAFT, and his career has not been the same, to say the least.
Wild.
So this is one of those ones we'll be able to point to and be like, no, this actually had long-lasting repercussions for somebody in the industry. I'm excited to tackle it, though. I think it'll be interesting. So thank you guys so much for listening. Please remember to rate, review, subscribe to the podcast. We got some emails this week. We appreciate that. Always love hearing from you.
Nice.
You can email us at blastzonepod@gmail.com. Suggestions, feedback, questions, anything. Or you can follow us on Twitter at blastzonepod. DM us on there, comment on our stuff, whatever you want to do.
Love to hear from you.
And we'll see you next time in the Blast Zone.
See you next time in the Blast Zone.
Blast Zone.